In the earliest centuries of Rome, before emperors wore crowns and before law was written in marble, there was a custom so cruel it was praised as loyalty. When a man of status died, his wife was expected to follow, not in grief, in fire. It was called lex conigalis, the marriage law. No ink ever signed it. No senate ever debated it. But to disobey meant dishonor, disgrace, and sometimes a slower death. This is the story of one woman who was meant to burn, and the silence she turned into a weapon. They tied her in white, a silk shroud, the color of bone, soaked through with oil at the hem. The crowd gathered in the forum, faces flickering in torchlight, eyes trained on the pyre. He had died the night before, noble and heavy with age, lips still wet with spiced wine. His wife, barely past her 20th year, did not weep. That would have been expected. Instead, she looked beyond the torches, beyond the ash-filled sky, to the Temple of Concord. Her name was Sabina, and in an hour she would be fire. The priest muttered prayers thick with tradition, asking the gods to welcome the wife's devotion. The law had no scroll, no wax seal, no recorded decree, but it was older than the republic itself. The wife of a nobleman must follow him into death. It was seen as loyalty, sacrifice, virtue. To resist was blasphemy, to run was treason. The guards who bound her wrists were not cruel. They had seen it before. Some wives screamed, some begged, some tried to leap before the fire was lit, just to own their end. Sabina did none of these. She stood still, her hair crowned in laurel, eyes dry. The crowd watched not in horror, but in awe, because this was Rome, and Rome demanded performance. Mothers whispered to daughters, "Learn, this is what love looks like." As the flames were lit and the heat kissed her bare feet, Sabina leaned forward slightly, not toward the fire but toward a figure in the crowd, cloaked in black, motionless, watching. Just before the first flame touched the hem of her robe, Sabina smiled. It was small, sharp, like a secret passed through generations. Then came the smoke, the screams, the realization that the body on the pyre was not Sabina's at all, but another, dressed in white. By the time they pulled apart the logs, Rome had already lost her, and somewhere, beneath the marble and myth, a new fire was being lit not with oil, but with memory. Sabina had vanished, but the silence she left behind would echo louder than the crowd's applause. Aelia's marriage was not her own. It was arranged in the way Roman unions were always arranged between fathers, sealed with wine, and celebrated like treaties. She was given to Marcus Livius on the spring of her 14th year, and though his temple gray hair marked him twice her age, he was still considered a good match. He had lands near Capena, influence in the Senate, and no living heirs to split his fortune. Aelia had been told she was lucky, lucky to be chosen, lucky to be saved from spinning wool until her skin cracked. But no one told her what came after the husband's final breath. She learned that from her mother's funeral. They had dressed her in garlands, fed her honeyed milk, and placed a coin beneath her tongue for the ferryman. Then, still breathing, they walked her to the edge of her husband's pyre and praised her courage. Aelia had watched from the crowd, unable to scream. Her mother had no voice in the end, only smoke curling from her open mouth as the fire swallowed her. That was the first time Aelia knew what silence really was. Now, 8 years later, she lived with that silence like a second skin. Marcus coughed blood each morning, and each evening she poured his mulled wine, watching it stain his lips with the same color as her dreams. He was not cruel to her. In truth, he called her dove. He kissed her forehead and praised her embroidery. But the law did not care about kindness. The law was not written, but every neighbor, every servant, every senator expected it. When a noble husband died, the wife must die too, not by dagger, not by poison, by ceremony, a death that honored the gods and the city. Aelia would be praised for it. Mothers would point at her and say, "That is a Roman woman." And yet, when she imagined her feet on the steps of the pyre, all she felt was cold. Not from fear, but from something older, deeper, a refusal so ancient it felt like bone. At night, she traced the curve of her arm and wondered how much of her still belonged to her. In the bathhouse, Older matrons whispered of other wives, ones who begged, ones who ran, ones whose names were no longer spoken. Alia said nothing. She listened. And every night, before she slept, she ran her fingers beneath the stone floor of her room where, hidden in a crack, lay the first piece of a plan. A needle, nothing more. But it was hers. Hers alone. And in a city where even death was choreographed, that small defiance was the first breath of something dangerous. It began with whispers, as most forbidden truths did. Alia first heard them in the far end of the bathhouse, where steam hung thick like a veil, and the scent of rose oil masked the weight of secrets. Two older women were speaking low, their heads nearly touching. One had lost 3 sons to the sea. The other wore widow's rings on every finger, but claimed no name. They did not see Alia listening, or if they did not care. She screamed, one said, kicked like a mule, bit the priest's hand clean through. The other shook her head. They gagged her with honeycloth, said it was to keep the gods from hearing her curses. Alia kept her gaze soft, her ears sharp. They spoke of a woman named Livia, long dead, erased from her family's history. When her husband fell in battle, she was bound and painted for the right. But as the crowd chanted her name, she turned and spit blood onto the feet of the officiant, not her own, her husband's. They say she threw herself into the crowd, clinging to her sister's legs. They dragged her back. Alia asked no questions. She simply remembered. Another tale, told later in the marketplace, spoke of a girl no older than 16. She vanished the night before her husband's pyre, only to be found drowned in the Tiber. They called it shame, but Alia saw something else in it, choice, the kind Rome never gave its daughters, but which some took anyway, teeth bared. The stories came like that, not all at once, but like wind through cracked shutters, uninvited, impossible to hold, impossible to forget. Each one struck a chord deeper than the last. She began collecting them silently, threading them into her mind like beads on a cord. A woman who swallowed a ring of lead rather than speak the ceremonial vow. One who had her maid disguise her in the robes of a stable boy and slipped away the night before the burning. Another who stayed silent and smiling, then stabbed herself in the neck just as the fire was lit. Her blood quenched the flame before it could reach her. These women were not remembered in statues. No songs bore their names, but Alia remembered, everyone. She wondered how many other wives sat quietly in their homes, hearing the same whispers, counting the same days, dreaming not of afterlives but of exits. It was in these unspoken legacies that she found something stronger than fear, a lineage not of blood but of refusal. Not all women screamed, not all women ran, but everyone who did left behind a crack in the marble, and Alia, without knowing yet how, was preparing to shatter the whole temple. It was in the shadow of the temple of Juno that Alia met the 2 women who would teach her the difference between escape and survival. They were not nobles, not even citizens, just freed women, both once owned by powerful houses, now living on the thin edge between invisibility and usefulness. One was called Tullia, sharp-eyed with a crooked smile and fingers stained from ink and dye. The other, quieter, went only by Vesta, her hair silvered early and always wrapped tight in linen. They sold perfumes and healing salves, but everyone in the alley knew they dealt in other things too, messages, forged tablets, favors wrapped in wax. Alia had passed their stall many times, always pretending not to look, but after the 5th evening, Tullia spoke first. "You wear death like a veil, girl. Might as well take it off while you're still breathing." Alia froze, the words lodging in her throat like a stone. Tullia chuckled and offered her a folded scrap of cloth. Inside was a list, names, all women. Some were crossed out, some had question marks. One name was her mother's. Not all went to the fire, Tullia said. Some learned to vanish before the smoke reached their feet. That night, under the guise of seeking a stronger sleeping draught for her husband, Alia returned. Vesta poured the mixture slowly, never looking up. "Most men die once," she said. "But wives like us, Rome tries to kill us twice. Once in the wedding, once in the morning." They told her of substitutions, 6 slaves, dressed in bridal white, drugged and burned in place of their mistress. They told her of false deaths, of priests bribed with foreign coin to fake the rite and whisper prayers over empty robes. They spoke of one woman who had carved open her own arm and painted a fever on her face so convincingly that even the undertakers refused to touch her. She escaped on a cart of plague linens, never seen again. Elia's heart pounded with every word, every stolen name. These were not tales from the bathhouse. These were instructions, maps drawn in blood and chance. But it's not enough to disappear, Tullia warned. You must become a wound they can't cauterize. Rome punished disobedience, but what it truly feared was legend. Elia asked them about the Vestal Virgins, those pale priestesses untouched by men, untouchable by law. Vesta laughed. They don't burn for their husbands, but if they break their vows, they're buried alive. Pick your cage, girl. That night, as Marcus coughed in his sleep and the wine on his lips dried to rust, Elia took out the needle hidden in the floor. She pressed it to her palm until it left a red mark, not deep but deliberate. She was not ready to run, not yet. But the story had begun, and she would not be written in ash. The house grew quieter as Marcus withered. His cough no longer barked through the halls but wheezed like wind through broken shutters. Servants walked softer, doors closed slower. Even the dogs seemed to lower their eyes. Elia moved through the villa like a shadow in her own life, her footsteps memorized, her smiles rehearsed. Every night she kissed his brow, every morning she prepared his wine. She no longer trembled when she stirred the poppy into it. He needed rest, she would say. Rome praised dutiful wives. Let them praise. She had learned the art of silence, the power of stillness. Her face never betrayed the fire building inside her. Only her hands gave her away, thumb brushing her palm, where the small scar from the needle burned like a buried coal. Each morning she awoke before the light, listening to his breath rasp through the chamber walls. Would today be the day? Would she wake to stillness? And what then? The pyre would be built within hours, the priests summoned, the silk robes laid out. They would tie her wrists with laurel and bathe her in perfume as if that made death sweeter. And all of Rome would watch as another woman was made a symbol. But Elia was no symbol. She had spent too long studying the cracks in the law, in the marble, in the people who followed it without question. She knew now how many women had disappeared beneath its weight, not because they were weak, but because no one remembered them. She would not vanish, not in fire, not in story. On the 13th night of Marcus's decline, his breath stopped. It was a small thing, no cry, no struggle, just the final exhale of a man who believed the world would end with him. Elia sat beside him until the sky turned pale. Then she dipped her fingers in the wine and smeared it gently across her own lips. Mourning, they would think, a sign of grief. The servants wept. The steward ran to the city to announce the death, and Elia, still in her nightrobe, stood by the window and watched the smoke of other homes curling in the distance. How many wives would be lost that day? How many stories ended before they began? She had only hours. The plan would have to hold. No turning now. She went to the garden and picked 3 sprigs of rue, bitter and strong, and pressed them to her chest. A signal. Tullia would know. In the catacombs beneath the perfume stall, someone would begin to prepare. A second robe, a second body, a second chance. Back in the chamber, Elia sat beside Marcus's corpse and took his hand in hers. She kissed his knuckles like a bride, then whispered, "Just once, you will not take me with you." The pyre rose by noon. Workers moved like ghosts, stacking cypress logs and layering herbs between the wood. Rosemary for purity, juniper for sanctity. Elia watched from behind the veil of mourning silk, her face hidden, but her spine straight as a spear. The crowd thickened as word spread. A senator had died. A noble wife would follow. Even the praetor's messenger arrived to witness the rite, his scroll tucked under one arm like a spectator's ticket. Rome loved its ceremonies, especially the cruel ones dressed in virtue. Elia felt their eyes, not on her grief, but on her performance. Would she cry? Would she kneel? Would she look beautiful as she burned? The questions buzzed like flies. She did not answer them. She only stepped forward when summoned, hands folded like a statue, movements measured. The priest began the ritual with a hymn, voice loud enough to cover the murmurs rising behind him. Something was wrong. Alia heard it soft at first, like a frayed seam pulling loose, then louder, a whisper that grew teeth, a name, her name. She did not turn. Behind her, one of the palace guards had gone pale. Another leaned into the priest's ear. The hymn faltered. The crowd shifted. Something in the rhythm cracked. They knew, or thought they knew. Tullia's work had not been flawless. The decoy had been dressed too quickly, the body too cold, the silk too clean. The illusion so carefully spun began to fray, but Alia did not run. That was the brilliance of it. She stayed. She stood next to the pyre, regal, still veiled, still silent, because the body laid beside her, wrapped in ceremonial robes and doused in oil, was not hers. And she needed them to believe it was. One moment more. 2. The priest cleared his throat and continued. There could be no pause, no scandal, not today. The law, though unwritten, demanded spectacle. To question the ritual now would be to admit doubt. And doubt was weakness. The torchbearer approached. The crowd held its breath. Alia turned toward the fire and placed her hand on the bier. The silk shifted as the torch lowered. The flames caught the hem. Sweet smoke filled the air. The body began to burn. The heat stung her cheeks, but she did not flinch. Only when the first crack of bone split the silence did she step back, graceful as a widow, and lower her head. It was done, or so they thought. By nightfall, the streets were already echoing with admiration. She went to the edge. She chose honor. Rome should remember her name. But Alia was not in her home, nor was she in any tomb. She had walked away from the fire before it was lit, her veil handed to another, her voice sealed in silence. And beneath the city's stone veins, in a corridor lit by oil lamps and breathless hope, Alia opened her eyes and began again. The tunnels breathed, not with wind, but with memory damp and close, thick with the scent of old earth, smoke, and women's skin. Alia moved through them like a newborn ghost, stripped of silk and rank, her fingers grazing stone walls etched with forgotten names. Some were scratched shallow, with broken nails or bone splinters. Others had been carved deep, letter by letter, into the limestone ribs of the city's underbelly. Here, the dead were not mourned. They were preserved, rewritten. She had not known what to expect when she left the fire behind, only that Tullia would wait. And she had. Just beyond the merchant stalls and the scent of crushed lavender, there was a stair hidden behind a shelf of dye pots. Vesta had barred the way with salt and prayer. Beneath it the Undercity, a place where Rome's discarded women gathered, not to hide, but to remember. They called it the sanctuary, not aloud, only in touch, in looks, in breath passed between cracks. Some wore veils of mourning still, but not for men. Others had burned their ceremonial robes and wore tunics of undyed wool, hair shorn, eyes sharp. One woman had no tongue cut out before her escape, but she told stories with her hands, faster than most could speak. Another had once served in the house of a magistrate and now mapped escape routes with charcoal and ash, drawing labyrinths no soldier could follow. Alia listened more than she spoke. She had learned silence as survival, but now, among these shadows, she saw what silence could become: weapon, refuge, revolution. The women here did not cry. They built, they taught, they trained. One held a dagger carved from olive wood, not to kill but to teach grip and stance. Another boiled herbs and bark into elixirs that mimicked death so closely they could fool even the most devout priest. Alia watched, then she learned, then she practiced. They did not call her noble here, they called her sister. She was not the first to flee the pyre, nor would she be the last. But something in her escape had rippled wider than the others. Her face had been seen, her name had been praised. Rome believed she had chosen death. And that belief, Tullia said, was power. "You are not a ghost," she told Alia one night, while painting ash on her cheeks. "You are a crack in their story, and cracks let the fire in." Alia traced her fingers along the wall that night, stopping at a name she did not recognize. It was etched beside a handprint, small and smudged. She pressed her own palm beside it and closed her eyes. Somewhere above them, Rome continued its endless march of rituals and myths. But here, below the marble and myth, a new story was being written in blood, in breath, and in women who refused to burn. Years passed, and still the smoke from that pyre was spoken of in hushed awe. They called her the widow of fire. The Senate praised her virtue, her beauty, her silence. Statues were drafted, poems composed. Aelia Livia, wife of Marcus Livius, who chose to die with grace, who embodied the soul of Rome, but no one ever found her ashes. No urn bore her remains, and still no one asked why. The law had never been written, but her death sealed it like ink. For a time, the tradition grew quiet. A few families hesitated. Some whispered of delaying the wife's sacrifice, of honoring her from afar. It was scandalous, yes, but so had been her courage. And Rome was addicted to myth. Meanwhile, in the catacombs and broken temples, the names of the vanished grew. Aelia taught others now, not as a ghost, but as a woman who had refused. Her face changed over time. She dyed her hair, learned to walk with a slight limp, learned to speak with a stammer. Learned, more than anything, how to vanish just enough to be safe, but not so far that no one could follow. And they did follow. Widows, betrothed girls, even one priestess who had been promised to a man she had never met. One by one, they were pulled from the fire's edge, sometimes through coin, sometimes through poison, sometimes simply by saying no and meaning it. Rome forgot Aelia in marble, but remembered her in movement. Quietly, the law softened. The ceremonies became rarer. Daughters began to question. Mothers, who had once wept at the pyres, began to close their doors. The priesthood still performed the rites, of course, but not as often, not with the same applause, and eventually, not at all. No decree was issued. No senators debated it. It simply vanished, like so many women had before it. And above ground, girls grew up never knowing they were once expected to burn. But beneath the city, carved into stone, the truth remained. Aelia never lit a revolution. She didn't need to. She simply refused to die. And that was enough to set 1,000 others free. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, stories of women who challenged silence and rewrote fate, then subscribe to Forgotten Stories, Ancient World. Comment the oldest law you've ever heard of, and if you want more truths that were nearly erased from history, like this one, don't forget to like and ring the bell.